I remember he was 3, and my husband had him on the bed, and he said, "That's not a page 1 story, it's a page 3 story," and so forth. And I think he was glad to see an absolutely carbon copy of himself with the blonde curls. He could talk to, how can a child of 3 know whether it's a page 1 or page 3 story? But my husband adored him.
Young Warwick Fairfax was still being bounced 30 years later. The sorry saga of the newspaper boy will be our main story this evening. Welcome to the programme. First up tonight, a rare and remarkable interview with Yasser Arafat. Arafat has been widely seen as the big loser in the Gulf crisis. By publicly embracing Saddam Hussein shortly after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization has clearly eroded support for the PLO cause even within the Arab world. Coalition leaders, including our own Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, have openly speculated that the Palestinians may now have to find more moderate leadership to represent them at any Middle East peace conference. Against that background, the embattled PLO chairman sent out word at the weekend that he was finally prepared to talk. The journalist he agreed to speak to was veteran Middle East correspondent Peter George. George was summoned to a heavily guarded location in Tunis at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Thank you, Mr.
No sooner had he sat down with Arafat than a minder handed the PLO leader a message that the Allies had just launched their ground offensive.
What does it tell you?
Started just now.
That was the extraordinary setting for Peter George's exclusive interview with Yasser Arafat.
Why did you align yourself with Saddam Hussein?
You have to understand that Saddam Hussein had supported the Palestinians when he had mentioned for the first time to make this linkage between the oil, which was the main reason for the American and European military presence in this area.
Did President Saddam tell you before the invasion of Kuwait that he would link it with the Palestinian issue?
No.
Was there any promise of this?
No. Please.
Then why do you think that he...
Please.
Why do you think that he has used this linkage?
Please. Not try to provocate me. Please. And I hope that you have to carry on with your question.
But why do you think...
Simple and clear, and I have to, you have the right, but you have to give me the right to answer. Please. This linkage was a request from our people under occupation. This is very important, under occupation. To President Saddam Hussein, after the Gulf crisis started, to make this linkage. And he had accepted it. And on the 12th of August, he declared his initiative, accepting the request of the Palestinians under occupation, in which he had declared the linkage between the two causes.
Do you not then feel disappointed that one of the first things he dropped in trying to bring about a ceasefire was the linkage of the Palestinians to this battle?
You know, what is going now is not the political issues. Now, the first start is ceasing fire and to achieve peace. And you know, after that, there will be the whole talks about the whole points, including Palestine, including South Lebanon, including the prices of the oil, including the security of the region. So this is the start. The start is ceasing fire to stop this blood war and to achieve real peace for all of us, not for one side and slavery to the other side.
If anyone is going to win in this war, it seems no winner.
Yes.
Including the Palestinians.
Yes. Including the Americans.
But including the Palestinians.
Including the Americans. For a very simple reason. You have to remember that that Britain and France had defeated Nasser.
But they lost in the end, I know. But
But
what I
they
want to
lost.
know, Mr.
Politically,
Chairman,
they lost.
Well, what I want to know, Mr. Chairman, is what do you think is going to happen to the Palestinians as a result of this conflict?
You know, this area, without achieving a real solution, with one standard for the international unity, the volcano will continue in this area.
Well, in that case, the Palestinians lose whichever way you look at it.
The Palestinians will lose, the Israelis will lose, the Americans will lose, the Arab nation will lose, the people in the Middle East will lose, the nations in the sea. We have nothing to lose. This is the point.
You can lose the friendship of the Saudis and the friendship of many Arab countries who've turned completely against you.
You see, that is, you think that you have to understand that the crux of the whole issue, the main cause in this area is the Palestinian cause. No stability, no security, no peace, no settlement by overjumping the Palestinian rights.
I mean, the Saudi ambassador to the United Nations describes you as a clown now. I mean, these are words that are never used between...
You see, please, I am not in a situation to reply the ambassador.
Why can you not reply when they...
I am not in a situation to reply the ambassador. I have to wait what His Majesty the King will say.
What about the Israelis in this case? Surely, if
they will lose,
in this case, it must
they will lose because this war gave the proof that security is not a military, not a military issue, not a power issue. This is the peace is a political agreement and not power. Not arrogance of power, but not missiles, not air forces, not tanks. Peace is a peaceful agreement.
What about the Israelis in this case? Surely if anyone wins in this war, it must be the Israelis.
They will not solve anything. More confusion and more damage. You have to understand that this war will leave deep traces and scars among the nations.
Is it fair to say that what we're looking at now is a more radical face of the PLO?
Why?
Because you...
Because I am speaking frankly to you, to let you understand. I said it in the beginning of the crisis. You remember? From the beginning, I said that this is not a war. There will be a catastrophe. And imagine what will happen, and especially the American troops, the British troops, began to use napalm, which is a forbidden weapons, unconventional weapons. What will be the retaliation from the other side? We want to stop this mad war. This was my appeal from the beginning. Enough is enough.
Is it fair to say that you have given up on the West and you're now looking at other ways of achieving your aims?
No,
we're looking at
for the Europeans, no. But for the Americans, I have enough lessons.
You have given up with them?
You see, I can't forget that they had deceived me personally many times.
So do you withdraw?
I can't say that I am give up. I can't give up from anything. I am a freedom fighter.
Do you withdraw the statements that you made in Geneva in 1988, recognizing Israel's right to exist and also renouncing terrorism?
I am completely committed to it because it is only the PNC who can change this political program.
So when Abu Abbas in January called for a war against the West and for Palestinians to strike in the West, that's wrong. You would denounce that?
Not to forget that I am the chairman of PLO and the president of State of Palestine.
But do you denounce what Abdul Abbas
You
calls
see,
for?
it is clear and obvious. You
No,
have
it's
to
not
go
going to
to
be, Mr.
ask.
Chairman.
No, you have to ask the others who had declared, and not me. What I am committed to is the PNC resolutions
But you must understand...
and the
you must
international legality.
But you must understand that in the West there is a great fear now. You've heard of it, you've seen it.
And you are not putting our fears in your consideration. While now there is a member in the Israeli cabinet, his political program is transferred for the Palestinians from the occupied territories.
Where do you go from here?
To my country.
You said to me once you were a stone's throw away from achieving a Palestinian state. Are you any closer now, or are you much, perhaps you're a Scud missile distance away now?
Closer now. For a very simple reason. Because no stability, no security, no peace, no settlement by overjumping the Palestinian rights. And even those on the other side with the American alliance from the Arabs, they are in need to fulfill their promises to their masses that they will continue making the linkage, but after the solution of the Gaza crisis.
So the West is wrong when they say Arafat has made his biggest mistake and he's finished.
You see, you had repeated the same during Camp David. And you had repeated the same when, during the siege of Beirut. You have repeated the same during the siege of Tripoli. You see, you see, this is the will and the determination of the Palestinian people. And this is my guidance. I am following it. And it is only for the Palestinian people who decide who will represent them.
An unrepentant Yasser Arafat. Peter George obtained that exclusive interview for Four Corners. Well, from dissension within the Arab world to the bad blood inside another family, the Fairfaxes. This was to be a year of great celebration for Australia's oldest publishing dynasty, their sesquicentenary, 150 years of unbroken preeminence in newspapers. Instead, the great house of Fairfax has been divested and divided in surely the most improbable corporate drama the country has seen. With the reverberations still shaking the journalism and finance communities, David Marr presents a fascinating account of the Fairfax saga.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God.
This young man, reading the lesson at his father's funeral, was about to squander his inheritance.
And live for a while among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified.
Young Warwick Fairfax, a committed Christian and a Harvard MBA, would take only 3 years to waste his family's newspaper empire. Fairwater is the family's house on Sydney Harbour. The land tax they pay on this garden is nearly $1,000 a day. Here the boy's father and mother prepared young Warwick with great care for the coming debacle.
You see, I believe it's the Fairfax, John Fairfax to me has a unique place in Australian journalism. I think it's a sacred trust. And I think one should do one's best and stay. And shouldn't sell out for money if there's any way by which you can live without it. To me, it's a unique contribution to Australian journalism. To me, it's like the Wall Street Journal. To me, it's like the New York Times. And papers of that quality who really are there so that people can tell the truth, and the proprietor does not go in there for his own profit, you know, or for his own power or whatever. To me, it's a sacred trust.
The Melbourne Age and the Sydney Morning Herald were once this country's most secure and influential newspapers. Now the banks are hawking them for sale, along with all the other wreckage of Australia's last boom.
What's at stake are 2 of the top 10 media assets in the world, without any question. What is also at stake is the integrity of a major media group in terms of its independence and ownership.
Mark Burrows is a key figure in this story. In the beginning, he tried to stop young Warwick Fairfax and his mother Mary taking over the empire, and now he's back at the end, advising the banks how to sort out the mess.
I've been in this game for 23 years, and I think, as I said to you before, it's so bizarre, so amazing, that even the most talented scriptwriters in the world could never invent the story.
This is the boardroom of John Fairfax in Sydney, once the voice of old conservative Australia. From here, the word went out to all the Fairfax papers to speak for God, the Crown, and the Liberal Party. Sir Warwick Fairfax sat here as chairman for nearly 50 years. He was a hands-off proprietor until, encouraged by his third wife, Mary, he took charge as the Committee of One. It was a heady time for Sir Warwick and Lady Fairfax, but bad business for the empire. The papers began to lose money. So his eldest son, James, and his younger cousin, John Fairfax, combined to sack the old man, and James took his place at the head of the table. There was bad blood in the family now, but the Fairfaxes prospered again. Young Warwick Fairfax first sat here as an observer. He was still a student at Harvard. He heard everything, and he said nothing of his own plans, though we now know he was beginning to prepare for his takeover. Mary Fairfax never sat here. Despite all her denials, she did want a seat on the Fairfax board. And for 30 years, the rest of the family, the Fairfax management, and eventually her own son combined to make sure that she was kept out.
What I wanted to do was do what my mother did to my father and be his wife. My mother used to stir my father's sugar, and I still like that best. I mean, to me, being a man's wife is one of the nicest things you can be. And having his children, I said, Warwick, no more business. I want to be your wife and love you and have as many children as possible. I set out to do that.
The marriage of old Warwick Fairfax and Mary Simons was a sensation in WASP Sydney 30 years ago. He was 58, head of a rich Protestant family. She was 35, a Warsaw Jew who'd worked hard and done well in the Sydney rag trade. Old Warwick's passion was religious philosophy. She was an energetic socialite. Both were married. There were court battles over money and children. David McNichol of the Bulletin remembers that time well.
It caused a hell of a lot of talk at the time. You've got to realize that Mary Fairfax is a very vital, extraordinarily vital woman, and she was she gave that vitality to Warwick. There's no doubt about that. And even the people who don't particularly like Mary would be the first to admit that her vitality is incredible, and she passed that on to Warwick, and she gave Warwick a feeling that he had to live more, live perhaps more dangerously, get more involved in his business, which was one of the things that she really stirred him up on, to get more of a hands-on proprietor. And so to that extent, I think she was she represented a turnaround in Warwick's life.
Young Warwick was born after a difficult pregnancy in 1960. He was heir to the empire, even though he was the old man's second son. For the boy's half-brother James would never marry. James was already on the board of the newspapers. He travelled and amassed a great art collection.
It begins in the top right-hand corner.
In 1964, he commissioned the painter Donald Friend to do a mural of the Fairfax dynasty's 150 years in Australia.
The figure on the left, being crowned, is my father, who'd completed at that stage his major philosophical work, The Triple Abyss, and he's supposed to be crowned by the muse of philosophy. The Fauntleroy figure everyone takes to be young Warwick, although it certainly wasn't my suggestion in the outset. The lady chasing the butterfly is his mother Mary. My only objection to her was when she interfered with the affairs of the company.
And she did this often?
She did it from time to time in various different ways, yes.
What did she really want?
She wanted, I think, her husband to be in total control of the company, and then when he began to fail, she transferred that aim to her son.
And she was impatient for that?
I would say so.
And that is an important element in what then occurred?
Well, she was his mother.
The boy's achievements were advertised each year in the Christmas cards Mary Fairfax sent by the thousand to friends, family, writers and politicians. Young Warwick, off to his first job, farewelled by Buffums, the American spaniel. Young Warwick, touring America in the back of the Rolls they shipped over for the trip.
I saw him when he was a boy at Cranbrook. There was the normal family contacts. I used to take him out every school holidays. I used to have him to lunch, take him to a movie. When he went to Oxford, I saw him there once or twice. I maintained, in fact, what contact I could with him, but as to getting to know him, well, that's another question.
Is he a difficult person to know?
Well, he's very secretive and doesn't give way very much.
What was he raised to be?
In the sense of future career, do you mean?
Yes.
He was raised, I think, to be the person that would eventually run the company.
So he was your heir as well as your father's heir?
Oh, indeed he was, yes.
The boy was an awkward and solitary figure, the son of a man old enough to be his grandfather. Mary and old Warwick had also adopted two children, Charles and Anna. His cousin John lived next door to Fairwater and watched the boy grow up.
Well, I think he was given to believe from a very early age that he was an exceptional child, and there's no difficulty in accepting that to some degree, in that I believe he's an intelligent boy, an intelligent man. But I think to have told the world publicly that you had a son who was a genius when he was still in his teens, and even perhaps before that, I think that's an exceptional upbringing.
Who was telling the world this?
Specifically his mother. I don't think it's for me, appropriate for me to comment on her behaviour or her character. I mean, we're all individuals and she's entitled to do whatever she likes. But yes, I think some of the things that she's done have sat uncomfortably with what I would call the traditional Fairfax approach.
Ladies and gentlemen, the best-dressed man in show business, Liberace.
For a few weeks, she had a show on the Fairfax station in Wollongong.
Hello, I'm Mary Fairfax. Oscar Wilde said that nothing succeeds like excess. Our magnetic man, Liberace, is certainly excessive. Total luxury, his escape from the tough life of the Depression. He's a Polish, Italian, American exotic. His hero, Paderewski, a famous Polish pianist, gave him his stage name, Liberace. He's the joys of the jewelers, the furriers, the interior decorators, and the antique dealers. And he's also a dog lover. Mothers everywhere love him because they can feel how he loved his own mother.
Mother love is a subject never far from Mary Fairfax's lips.
Welcome, Liberace.
Thank you, Lady Fairfax, for that lovely and interesting introduction.
The show folded. Her husband's show was also in difficulties. Sir Warwick Fairfax was a figure from another age. a 76-year-old autocrat with little instinct for running a large public corporation. For 7 years, he'd ruled as the committee of one, and now the papers were losing money. In late 1976, the board realized the old man had to go. James had, in effect, to fire his own father.
Yes, indeed.
Was that the most difficult thing you've ever done in your life?
I suppose it was. I would say so, yes.
But essential.
Essential, yes.
From this, the bad blood flowed that led to the end of the empire. Lady Fairfax had urged her husband to take control. Now she found herself with him on the outer. She marked the sacking with a poem.
Her husband was made to leave the chairmanship of John Fairfax, written to him to comfort him, love poem number 9. Gather me up in your arms, wipe my eyes, for I've hurt my feet once more upon the stones of life. Your arms are my refuge, my comfort, my sanctuary. Here I rest until refreshed once more, I venture among the snares and joys of the world.
There were very severe wounds in those days, very severe wounds. He just thought that for his son to be one of the people who'd helped to take part in it was a very bitter blow to him.
Well, its immediate effect was to cause a 4-year breach between him and me, which of course included Mary as well. We were reconciled following a move made by him, an approach made by him at the end of that time. I had no reason to believe, and still haven't, that the reconciliation was not genuine, and it appeared to be genuine on her part too. But when one is considering the reasons for Warwick's action in making the takeover bid, I think it is clearly a factor.
Old Warwick and Mary Fairfax retreated to Fairwater. He devoted himself to Purpose, a sequel to his earlier philosophical work, The Triple Abyss. He was unhappy with the direction the papers were taking under his son James. They were making money, but making enemies. Mary began to entertain these enemies of the papers at Fairwater. Angry politicians like Neville Wran and the machine men of the New South Wales Labour Right came to dinner with the high flyers of Australian business. People like Bruce Judge and Kevin Parry, Ron Brierley and Peter Abels. Mary's friends often complained about the way the papers were treating them.
I believe in journalistic independence, and friends is a variable term. Some people profess to be friends and not quite what they profess.
Sir Peter Abels is a friend of yours, I understand.
Sir Peter Abels is very agreeable and pleasant to me.
And I understand that he was extremely distressed by some of the things that the Fairfax papers were writing about him.
Yes, that's true.
And that he made his distress evident to you.
Oh, yes, he did.
It's time to meet Martin Doherty. His profession is public relations. He is a PR man who once edited Rupert Murdoch's Daily Mirror. Martin Doherty was a loved and trusted guest at Fairwater. Sir Warwick and Lady Fairfax employed him. He was their PR. And PR for many in that Fairwater crowd. Men like Kevin Parry, Bruce Judge, and Sir Peter Abels. Marty Doherty is a key figure in this story. He would not talk to Four Corners. But even in those days, he talked to Fairfax editors. Were you aware that Martin Doherty was complaining to the editor of the National Times about the paper's stories about Sir Peter Abels?
Oh, I knew that complaints were being received about them, yes.
And that Martin Doherty was saying that it was the wish of the board that these stories not proceed?
Well, I don't think I knew that at the time, no.
He was not making these statements with your authority?
Oh, certainly not, no.
Whose authority was he making these statements
Well, I
with?
have no idea, but it wasn't the company's.
Did those complaints ever bear fruit?
It didn't stop the National Times writing about Sir Peter Abels.
The papers were loosening up under James Fairfax. They were no longer anti-Labour by instinct, but that didn't change the Labour view of Fairfax.
Well, I mean, you grow up with a culture of regarding them as having been the enemy. Your father told you they were the enemy, so there's no reason why you would dispute the view of your father on these things. And then when they don't do anything to change the view, then it's just part of Labor Party culture.
Ask Labour leaders like Graham Richardson why the Fairfax papers matter so much to them, and they're not sure.
It's a very good question. I know that the Telegraph's got more circulation, but I can't help the fact that every morning when I reach for a paper, it's always a Sydney Morning Herald. Perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of foreboding, I don't know, but I always reach for the Herald first. It's, again, it's part of Labor's culture. It was considered in Sydney, at least up until the 80s, as the thinking person's paper.
By the 1980s, there was far more to Fairfax than the Sydney Morning Herald. The company published the biggest selling paper in Australia, the Sun Herald, the only national business daily, the Financial Review, and in Melbourne, the very profitable and powerful Age. And of course, there was the television and national radio network.
The present chairman, Sir Warwick Fairfax, is a great-grandson of the original John.
The order of succession had been settled long ago. After old Sir Warwick, his son James, and then eventually little Warwick. James agreed, but also wanted his cousin John to have a turn at the helm. This month, when the family would have been celebrating 150 years in the business, James had planned to step aside for John.
And I would have recommended to the board that they elect my cousin John as chairman. And the other thing was that I would have stayed on the board, I think. We were all working, and that includes the general manager and John, to give Warwick every encouragement to eventually take on the role of chief executive.
So all he had to do was wait.
All he had to do was work his way through the company, not through the company, but apply himself as diligently as he could, and to show that he had the ability. That would involve waiting as well, of course.
Waiting and working.
Waiting and working, that's it.
Sir Warwick died at the age of 86, his book Purpose unfinished. At his deathbed at Fairwater was a Jesuit named Emmett Costello.
He'd lost the power of speech for several days, and the nurse in attendance said, "Look, he can't speak." Well, I grabbed him by a hand and I said, he hadn't spoken for several days. And I grabbed him by the hand and I said, "My dear Sir Warwick, you can approach Christ with joy, with optimism and great hope." And there's a pause, and all of a sudden, joy, the word came out, joy. And the nurse said, "Who spoke that?" I said, "I didn't. It came from him." That was the very last word he ever spoke on this earth.
Joy.
Joy.
There is a moment in the history of any dynasty when the release of forces long held in check can suddenly imperil that family's future. For the Fairfaxes, so rich, apparently so secure, old Warwick's death was that moment. His funeral was almost a state occasion. Prime ministers, governors and bishops joined the mourners. James and John were familiar figures, but the enigmatic young Warwick was the focus of attention.
Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ.
Young Warwick came home with two new religions. At Oxford, he was converted to Christianity, and at Harvard, to debt. Among the mourners here at his father's funeral were his half-brother, half-sisters, an adopted brother and sister, and his father's 3 wives. The Fairfaxes were a distinguished but complicated family. They seemed united in mourning, but in fact this was the last day they've ever been together, because young Warwick was about to bring the plans for the succession completely unstuck. In his brother's care, the Fairfax empire was more prosperous than it had ever been. Yet young Warwick and his mother both felt their inheritance threatened. They thought James' managers incompetent and they feared a takeover, even though the family still controlled nearly half the shares in the company. Warwick later gave evidence in court that Martin Doherty, his father's PR and confidant, had encouraged these fears. Doherty denies this. The funeral was behind them only a few weeks when mother and son moved to take control of the company. They approached Mark Burrows of Baring Brothers, leading financial consultants in Sydney.
Mary Fairfax came in here. This firm was retained by Warwick Fairfax and Mary to advise them on possible options, as it turned out, with respect to the acquisition of Fairfax by Warwick.
And you never doubted that they were joint ambitions?
It never occurred to me in the entire time that I dealt with Mary Fairfax and spoke to Warwick on numerous occasions on the telephone at Harvard, that they were other than inseparable. We gave a piece of definitive advice, which was a 24-page written document, which is one of the few written documents that has ever emerged in 3 or 4 years on Fairfax, that said categorically, 1, there is no threat, 2, the proposal is financially unsound, and 3, that if you proceed with this, it will end in disaster.
Doherty had presented Laurie Connell as the man who could do the deal, and that's what Warwick wanted to hear. Laurie Connell was then chairman of the merchant bank Rothfuls, a key player in what's become known as WA Inc. He now faces some 40 charges under that state's company code. About his role in Fairfax, Laurie Connell would not speak to Four Corners. Doherty asked Burrows to discuss his paper with Laurie Connell.
Now, the upshot of it all was that I said categorically no, that I would not involve this firm with Mr. Connell as a matter of principle. And secondly, that my advice still stood, and that in my view, were Warwick to join with Laurie Connell in the privatisation of Fairfax, the result would be failure and it would be fatal for Warwick. As far as I was concerned, that was the end of our role. I had other things to do with my life, and I had the integrity of the firm to be concerned with, and that I would send him a bill for my time.
Which was? In
advising him about $120,000. I was obviously unaware of what everybody else was charging, but that was just a straight professional time charge. I think I must be the only person that charged under $5 million. I had no idea the gravy train was so large. And I sent in the bill, and that was it.
By the time all this was over, Warwick would spend his fortune on fees to advisors. Here at the start, he offered Connell $100 million to bring off the Fairfax deal. Laurie cut Doherty in for $10 million of that.
I never met Laurie Connell until after the privatisation. I wanted to meet the man who had done it after it was done, and I asked Warwick if he'd bring him, because I hadn't met him. I didn't know anything about that horrendous fee.
The $100 million.
I mean, it's absurd.
At some point, Warwick asked his mother to join the board.
One day, he said, before this happened, Mummy, you were so bright, would you go on the board? I was so touched, not because I really liked to be on board much, but to read all those papers and go to meetings. It's not my idea of total and absolute bliss. And, but my child wanting me, that was total and absolute bliss, the fact that he wanted me. But that very afternoon, Martin Doherty contacted me and said, you mustn't go on. People say, Warwick's not mature and so forth. And you know, all the alarm bells rang. Something, I thought to myself, I'm not being told and Martin does not want me to find out. Of course, it was the fee, because I would have never, ever agreed to it. I like to work in harmony with people, not fight them. It's just such a waste of time, unproductive too.
Did you press your son to make the privatisation?
That would be the total reverse of the truth. I would have never, ever pressed him. First of all, he wouldn't have listened if I had. He's rather like his father.
But you did allow him to pledge your shares to the privatisation?
Yes, because he was my child. I didn't want to do it, but I did not know. Had I known about the fee, even though he was my child, I wouldn't have allowed him to do it.
Young Warwick sat at this table as an observer and heard all the company's secrets and gathered its financial records. And then, when the time came, he fed it all to his takeover team.
I do think he abused the confidence that we put in him. He was attending board meetings, he was privy to everything about the company, and yet, unbeknown to us, of course, at that time, he was, and perhaps had been for some considerable time, planning his takeover.
Without the ANZ Bank, none of these plans would have mattered a damn. Now's the time to meet ANZ's Managing Director, Will Bailey. These were the late 80s, and this was the biggest takeover the ANZ had ever been involved in. Mr. Bailey took advice from a QC before deciding not to talk to Four Corners. Bailey agreed to lend this untried young man $1.76 billion without meeting him. He came to you on the night of the 30th of August, 1987. What was it that he wanted?
Well, he really wanted our agreement to privatise the company. But the proposal was that he privatise the company in such a way as he would have the majority control. He'd have total control. And that, of course, was unacceptable to us.
He wanted to tell me that he was very worried about the threat of a takeover, and the shares had gone up in price, and he believed that Holmes Court was going to move very soon, and that he'd obtained the finance from the ANZ Bank the previous Friday, and he was proposing to launch a takeover bid the next day at 9 o'clock in the morning.
How did you react to that?
Well, with considerable shock and astonishment, as I had no idea that he was planning to do it. When we went through it afterwards, it seemed to us highly doubtful whether the company would earn enough to pay for its probable borrowings, and that was before the stock exchange crash.
Mary Fairfax knew when the stock markets of the world crashed on the 20th of October 1987 that the takeover should now be called off. Most of her fortune was at stake. Her son was at the Regent Hotel in Sydney. She came down here to beg him to withdraw the takeover.
And he could have said to the stock exchange, there's been a great fall in the market, I'd like to withdraw. He could have withdrawn at that point. I thought he was endangering himself.
Warwick was upstairs with his advisors, including Martin Doherty. The question was, should they press ahead? They had to raise over $1 billion by selling Fairfax assets. Most of the Age, all the radio stations, all the Financial Review. But now over half that cash was in doubt because the buyers, men like Robert Holmes Court, were being hammered on the exchanges, and the takeover was starting to look like an extraordinary gamble. In the foyer, she wrote him a desperate note. He refused to let her come up to the room and would not take her calls. It's impossible to have a short conversation with my mother, he explained. So the note was taken up to a suite on the 34th floor. She remembers writing these words, "Please don't do it. Please stop being influenced by Doherty. It's very bad. Just withdraw." Her son had everything to lose, and her own Fairfax shares at stake in the deal were worth about $200 million. Laurie Connell and Marty Doherty, on the other hand, risked nothing if the deal went ahead, and if it still succeeded, there was the $100 million fee to split between them. Warwick took the note, glanced over it, screwed it up, and threw it in the bin. Later that night, he talked to his mother for a couple of hours on the telephone, but she couldn't persuade him to draw back. All his life, she'd been preparing him for the moment when the Fairfax empire was his, and now he was happy to risk everything to have it. She had the shares to stop him, but yet she let him go ahead.
I've been a big loser in this because I allowed Warwick to do this, but he wouldn't have done it without Martin Doherty.
Why was your son vulnerable to men like Martin Doherty?
Only because his father had died, and it was done so quickly. I was pretty vulnerable too. I wasn't thinking very well.
Warwick's team took possession of the company just before Christmas 1987. The new proprietor, you'll remember, was a keen Christian, and at this key point in the fortunes of his company, he left for a few weeks' missionary work in New Guinea.
James lost the chairmanship but found himself a free man and $160 million richer. He might have had twice that, but he sold young Warwick most of his shares for some $265 million less than the market price.
Because I didn't ask for it, those shares I'd undertaken to my father to pass on to Warwick, and I regarded myself as being bound by that undertaking.
John used Warwick's cash to build a chain of country papers here and in America. His anger is tinged with admiration.
Because I think what he did was bold, and he had his own motives, and he had his own reasons for doing what he did. And he said to me at the time that, you know, this may well be a disaster, but he had to give it a go. Now, from our perspective, it was madness, it was ludicrous, and it meant the end of what was a great newspaper organisation.
Marty Doherty, appointed director and managing editor of all the Fairfax papers by the new proprietor, had reached the high point of his career to date. The old PR man soon found himself brawling with the journalists, led by Chris Anderson, editor-in-chief of the Sydney Morning Herald.
Marty said that he thought that the paper had strayed from being a journal of record. He thought that it went out too far, particularly in its business sections, to look for enemies. And I think, by and large, he wanted to see if he could change that.
Doherty started to heavy Anderson over stories in the papers involving figures like Bond, Bill McBride and Laurie Connell. You'd worked in Fairfax a long time. You'd seen stories queried, you'd seen stories challenged and stopped before. So what was new about this?
David, I don't know if I'd seen a story stopped. I've certainly seen stories queried. I've certainly understood that, by and large, that we used to tread carefully in certain areas. It seemed to me that Marty looked too carefully for some of his friends, including Laurie and people like that. And I suspected that that might start to permeate deeper than it had shown.
What was the upshot of all that?
Well, by and large, I think that when I resigned, a lot of the other members of senior staff, not only editorial, also decided that they would go as well. And after a lot of negotiation and nonsense, it ended up in Marty's resignation.
Former board member
Doherty left with a payout of $3 million plus. He exits the papers and this story. Anderson took his place on the board. The journalists and bankers were relieved.
Style, I believe you appoint good editors, you trust them, and you let them go.
Business boomed, and it looked as if young Warwick might pull it off, despite Mark Burroughs' predictions of disaster.
I'll say this to you, that for the first year after he took the company over, a lot of people said to me, well, you know, you made a mistake. Bear in mind the earnings of Fairfax went exponentially as a consequence of the boom that we had and the money that was pumped in and real estate ads and classifieds, and the earnings of Fairfax looked like a hockey stick for the first year. So I maybe for 6 months I looked wrong. But time happened to come my way.
As proprietor, Warwick Fairfax was as enigmatic as ever. It was odd that he didn't seem to know what to do. But it was extraordinary that he didn't seem to want to do anything. He gave very little away.
What do you think of the Telegraph merging?
He wanted the world to leave him alone, but the banks would not. He'd promised to pay them back about $500 million, and they were demanding he keep that promise. To raise that money, he turned to America and the booming junk bond market. Junk bonds that paid investors high yields, but for high risks.
once more. For the clients of Drexel Burnham Los Angeles, creators of the booming junk bond market, Warwick Fairfax made his television debut.
This is a great company with a proud heritage. Our new management will ensure a dynamic future, allowing us to exploit the opportunities of the region, the fastest growing part of the globe.
The tape painted a bright future for Fairfax, but the question is how much the Fairfax team told the investors the company was worth. The new editorial director, Chris Anderson, went on the road selling junk.
I would say that at that stage it was said that although you wouldn't be able to meet cash interest for some time, that by and large the totality of the company would be worth $2 billion, something like that.
$2 billion?
Yeah, that sort of level, David, because it was an extension of the multiples, and there were much higher multiples that were generally accepted in media in those days.
Let's make sure that it's gonna be. Even before the Fairfax bonds were sold, Drexel's world began to fall apart. The Fairfax team was dealing with a company charged with fraud and market manipulation.
It's always difficult, I would have thought, maintaining the propriety of papers like the Herald and the Age and the Financial Review if you're going to be dealing in junk bonds.
Right. Have you had the same advertisement in before? Do you have a monthly account with the Herald?
These telephones were now Warwick's lifeline.
And the name that the account is to go to?
The junk had raised $450 million to keep the banks happy, but there was still over $1.5 billion in debts to service. Only an endless boom in classified advertising would rescue Warwick from this mess.
It reads burial sites, side by side.
Classifieds are the life's blood of the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. In booms, a river of money, but in busts, the money dries up. Warwick was about to have the recession he didn't need to have. The phones stopped ringing. It was as simple as that. In the boardroom, Chris Anderson and his fellow directors were worried. Warwick Fairfax went off to America, chasing fresh advice and new backers, while back here the banks got very nervous. It was as if he believed that no matter what, there was an advisor somewhere who could rescue him. His own board came up with a scheme that faced financial reality. Warwick and Mary's ownership of the company would be reduced from 100% to nearly 5.5%. But they couldn't face this, sacked most of the board, some executives, others like Chris Anderson walked. There was blood everywhere, and day by day this carnage was reported meticulously in the Fairfax papers. Then late last year, the banks called back Mark Burrows, the man who in the first place had said, "Don't do it."
The banks were owed $1.2 billion. The junk bond holders were owed under $500 million, and Warwick was still maintaining that Lazard Frere in New York would come up with an overseas buyer that would pay enough money for enough of Fairfax and would overcome the problems of the government with foreign ownership to enable not only the junk bond holders to be satisfied, but for Warwick and his mother to have a substantial equity in the company. Now, to any observer of any sort of rudimentary financial analysis, that was clearly nonsense. And I think that was what, in fact, initiated the banks into contacting us, and equally they were concerned about the erosion of the value of the asset. That month went very quickly, and to put not too fine a point on it, it ended in the receivership of John Fairfax some 5 weeks after we were appointed.
Warwick Fairfax did grant us one interview in the afternoon the receivers were appointed. He'd returned alone to the house he rented in the Sydney suburbs. There was no one with him, no one to answer the door. We learnt very little from this exchange, but this is the face of a man who has just lost everything.
Mr. Fairfax, hello. David Marr is my name. I'm from ABC Four Corners. Can I speak to you for a couple of minutes?
I don't have anything to say, I'm afraid.
Is there nothing to say at this time?
Not at this time, no.
Is it all over?
The company is in receivership, if that's what you mean.
And that means that there is no more Fairfax connection with the company?
I don't have anything more to say.
How do you feel about it at this time?
I'm not commenting at this stage.
Not even on how you feel?
No.
Oh, did he really? Oh, God, what a classic.
The independence of Fairfax journalism was protected once because journalism was the family's only business. Now the papers are up for sale, up for grabs to businessmen and consortiums of all kinds.
What do we want? Free press!
It's a perilous situation. In the last 10 days, Fairfax journalists in Sydney and Melbourne have been out on strike after the co-receiver intervened over a story involving his accountancy firm Deloitte's. The coming sale of the papers has got the market very excited. The brokers, after all, haven't got much else to look forward to in 1991.
There are 5 parties that have publicly expressed an interest in being investors in Fairfax. The first group is Jamieson with Chris Corrigan, which is effectively a cash box with up to about $300 million. The second group is an American group called Hellman and Friedman that have consistently expressed an interest in investing over $100 million in Fairfax. There are a number of other groups. John Fairfax, through his advisors, has expressed an interest, John Fairfax Jr., in coming back into Fairfax. The major Australian institutions have expressed a real interest in coming back into Fairfax. 3 or 4 of the major stockbrokers have expressed an interest in underwriting Fairfax.
Are Kerry Packer and Rupert Murdoch possible buyers for Fairfax?
There have been no indications that either of those people are either interested or capable of buying Fairfax.
You rule them out absolutely?
At this stage, yes.
How strong's the Packer bid?
I suspect that it's fairly strong. Mr. Packer's a man of great means. I would have thought that if he genuinely does want Fairfax, or parts of Fairfax or whatever, then he'd have a reasonable chance of getting it. I don't know. I haven't been consulted about that.
What would the response of journalists be if Packer were to take over at Jones Street?
Well, journalists always fear for the future. I mean, we're fairly insecure people. But by and large, there has to be owners, and there are a dearth of owners in Australia. So I think Packer's got to be considered with every other owner.
Hey, Shuggy. Yes, you've got no name tag on today. Poor little sugar plum. Now, I'm working, little love. I think you'd better stop getting caddies. And there we are. Lee, what's that, dear?
I need signatures on these 3, please.
You need what signatures on what ones? Oh, is that for Harrington? Is that the wages checks?
Yes.
Okie dokie.
Mary was able very skillfully to rescue about $40 million from the wreckage.
If we could get something like it much cheaper, you know, and if we could get this for Charlie's room.
She's working with her interior decorator on plans for a magnificent apartment in New York's Pierre Hotel.
And that's the stark carpet.
Yes. Hold on.
Her son has returned to America for the birth of his child. Young Warwick appears to have lost everything.
Is he still your brother?
Well, we're both sons of the same father.
Will the family look after him now?
Which part of the family?
Your family.
Well, there's only me in my family, and I see no obligation to look after it.
Lady Fairfax had once gone to church to pray for her son. 5 masses, she said, in 2 days during the Salzburg festival.
And I went there because I just wanted Lord to keep an eye on my son, surrounded as he was, I felt, by a malign force.
Do you think the Lord has kept an eye on him?
I feel that the story is not finished, and I feel that if you really believe, as I truly believe, things will come.
That things will come good?
I hope so.
Well, where Lady Mary still sees hope, I'm afraid most people affected by her son's disastrous privatisation feel only despair. Even as we were putting the finishing touches to David Marr's report today, Fairfax journalists were picketing ANZ House in Sydney, home, of course, of the bank that gave young Warwick the rope they fear has hung them all. That's all from Four Corners for this week. Join me again next Monday night at 8:30. See you then. Good night.